Simone! Today is going to be a very spicy episode because I am going to be asking the question, do gays lead to the collapse of civilization?
The fall of Rome. Joe Rogan had this to say on his podcast.
Fascinating that at the end of empires, they get really concerned with gender and hermaphrodites.
The Roman femboy, fully grown and willing to take on the role of a common Roman woman. Even the emperor himself donned girly outfits, mascara, and held many chamber parties. The Roman Senate began having debates to determine if, quote, being with a femboy was a totally gay thing after all.
So this is one of those things that I thought was really good for like us to do, because I think our audience knows that we would be honest with them about what we found on either side of this issue. Okay. Like there is no answer I could come to on this question that's not going to piss off some large part of our audience. So, you're getting an honest answer from me. And a lot of people, what made me think about this is I heard, if you look at Christians today, because I was reading a piece about how different the modern Christian and conservative movement is from the historic Christian and conservative movement. And they pointed out that if you look at Christians today who argue to ban things like same-sex marriage, they base their arguments on the Bible. But if you look at historic conservatives, you go back to a Ronald Reagan or something like that, they base their arguments on loosening sexual mores, specifically around gay sex, will lead to the collapse of civilization. And they don't really mention the Bible that much in why they argue for this stuff anyway. And it makes a lot more sense. Like, I argue that, like, okay, if it was true that gays or loosening sexual boundaries around gayness could lead to the collapse of a civilization, like if that was a trend that kept happening over and over again in history, like, I can understand like the morality of putting a law around gay marriage. I never understood why you'd want to police somebody else's marriage, but I was like, oh, the collapse of civilization. That makes sense. But the Christian argument makes no sense to me because, like, obviously these people don't believe what you believe about God or Christ, so you're not really helping them. Like,
right?
How does it help a non what you would think of as is your type of Christian person for you to enforce them to follow a few Christian rules?
Yeah,
like, that's not the core point of. That's like broadly against everything Christian when it's supposed to be that, if you're a traditional Christian, non a techno Puritan, you would say, well, Christ died for your sins and it is through him that you get to God. Like, and even what Christ said, he's not a Sharia law guy, he's render unto Caesar, right? Like, Christianity is actually distinct among the major religions, and that it does not talk a lot about how you should govern a country, and explicitly has built within it a separation of church and state, which I argue is one of the reasons it has been such a successful religion. It's much better to build religion that way. And that when you get a merger of church and state, as you have seen within some Christian churches, the churches get watered down super quickly, which is funny. A lot of people think the reason you shouldn't have a merger of church and state is because the church will impose all sorts of theocratic rules on people, when in reality, no, it's that the state and the bureaucrats are very good at watering down churches, and that you really only get strong churches in regions where you don't have a melding of church and state.
Right.
But it happens every time. So the melding happened recently, you might still get some theocratic stuff, but if it's 100 years ago, 200 years ago, no, it's typically wishy-washy. But a lot of this comes down from JD Unwin's work, which is where the theory was initially posed. So I'll go into his arguments for this concept. JD Unwin's work, frequently cited in support of the claim, provides a theoretical framework. His 1934 book, Sex and Culture, studied 86 societies and concluded that strict sexual restraint, prenuptial chastity, absolute monogamy correlates with cultural flourishing, while sexual liberalism leads to decay within 3 generations. However, Unwin's focus is on general sexual norms, not specifically same-sex relationships, and his methodology has been critiqued for lacking direct causation. For the claim, I told it to steelman both positions. Unwin's findings are interpreted by some, like Roy F. McPaul's blog, to suggest that Western sexual revolution, late 1960s, could lead to a collapse by the 2070s, with modern factors like antibiotics and pornography accelerating the decay. Comments in various articles also link homosexuality to moral decay, citing studies on intimate partner violence, IPV, from the University of Torino? These are disputed. Well, I mean, I know that IPV is super high in lesbian communities, in gay communities. I'm going to ask Claude.
That's Yeah, that's somewhat, huh.
Yeah, it says, even Claude says, higher or equal to heterosexual men, was it happening in 25 to 33% of gay relationships. So, okay, that's like not a bad argument there, right? Like, if you're like, well, it's associated with societal ills found within these relationships, and I think few people would argue that intimate partner violence isn't a societal ill, that, you know, it might make sense to have regulations against the claim. Critics, including historians on Reddit's Ask Historians, ooh, such veracity there, argue Unwin's work is too broad with no direct evidence linking same-sex relationships to collapse. The Guardian article 2015 satirizes the claims, calling it a slippery slope argument, e.g. leading to polygamy, animal marriages, fevered ramblings. But a lot of the slippery slope stuff has turned out right. Like, I remember I was in GSAs as a kid, and it would have been considered homophobic. Like, I remember because somebody mentioned this and they got like chewed out and like yelled at and shut out of a room to suggest that trans people would ever attempt to compete in the sport of their gender, specifically that trans women would try to compete in women's sports. They were like, that's just homophobic, slippery slope, you know, insane ramblings. And now they're doing that. Like, the normalization of MAPS, these are minor attracted persons, is a movement that has been growing, I'd say, for like the past 10 years or so in terms of normalization. So I don't know if I agree with that, right? Like, so I then said, okay, I can do research myself, Mr. Unwin, because I also hate the progressive argument against this.
Yeah.
It's like, well, just that you keep getting cases of gays being accepted and then civilizations collapsing doesn't mean it's causal, right? I'm like, if it happens like every time, counter hypothesis here.
Okay.
It could be the sign of cultural flourishing. So what we need to do is look at broadly agreed civilizational collapses.
Okay.
Look at when homosexuality was accepted and see if it was accepted more in the period before the collapse or in the period earlier, like early in that civilization's history before its rise.
I don't like where this is going because I'm pretty sure it was mostly broadly. Well, actually, I'm not sure.
You might be surprised. You might be surprised.
Yeah. Now that I'm thinking about it, actually, no.
But the first one I ran with didn't turn out well for the gays. So this was on the Islamic Empire, because I often feel that people
was there ever support for gays?
Oh, a lot, yeah. Okay, so in the medieval Islamic world, same-sex relations were documented across several distinct periods, with certain eras showing more visible evidence than others. The early period, 8th to 9th century CE, is particularly notable for its relatively open discussions of same-sex desire in literature. This was the era of the poet Abba Nuwas, who wrote explicit homoerotic poetry while serving in the court of Harun al-Rashid in Baghdad. Literary anthologies from this period collected numerous poems and anecdotes that referenced same-sex desires and relationships. The High Medieval period, 10th to 13th centuries, across various regions of the Islamic world, including in Al-Andalus, Muslim Spain, Baghdad, Cairo, and other urban centers, produced significant literary and scholarly works that acknowledge same-sex practices. This includes works by scholars like Ibn Hams Corbo, who wrote The Ring of the Dove and discussed various forms of love, including same-sex attraction. The Ottoman period, particularly 16th and 18th centuries, has documented evidence of institutionalized same-sex practices, especially in certain contexts, like the Korek dancers, young male dancers who performed in feminine attire, and relationships with certain Sufi orders. So this is like, even in like the priesthood, apparently was normal, like in Sufi orders, and the you had like dancers who would dance as like males, but it was during specific periods. So then I ask, okay, when were the major collapses of Muslim civilization? And so I'll just remind you here. Okay, so the first period when gays were normalized within Muslim culture was the early Abbasid period, 8th to 9th century CE. Okay, first collapse, 9th to 10th century CE, fragmentation of the Abbasid Caliphate. The centralized authority of the Abbasid Caliphate based in Baghdad gradually weakened, with various regions breaking away under local dioceses. Okay, that supports it. Okay, then the next period was the High Medieval during the 10th and 13th centuries. Mongol invasion, 13th century. Perhaps the most devastating shock to the central Islamic lands, the Mongol quest of Baghdad in 1258 ended the Abbasid Caliphate and caused numerous destruction of infrastructure, including libraries and irrigation systems. Many historians consider this a significant turning point. And then the post-Mongol period of 13th, 15th century is also directly after this period of acceptance, 10th to 13th century. While not a dark age, this saw political fragmentation and some decline in certain scientific fields in the central Islamic lands, though there was still significant cultural and intellectual achievements. Okay. Well, there was the other period, the Ottoman Empire period, particularly the 16th and 18th century. Okay, the late Ottoman periods, the 18th and 19th century was the next collapse. The Ottoman period experienced relative decline compared to rapidly advancing European powers, though it was more about comparative advancement rather than absolute regression. So, batting pretty much zero here was Muslims. It would look like if we're looking at Muslim empires, there was a direct correlation to normalization of loosening of sexual restrictions around gays and imperial collapse. So
well,
let's go.
I would try to justify this saying, okay, there are some cultural traditions that just don't support same-sex attraction, but others do. And clearly Islam and same-sex attraction, like these are just two cultural technologies, or like this is a cultural technology with a lifestyle that is not compatible.
Mm-hmm. So let's go to the next one. This one is more interesting. Rome. So what do you have some knowledge?
My guess with Rome is that gay relationships, especially like the man-boy lover gay relationships that were so normalized, were not something that was late stage Roman Empire. I think that was earlier stage. And the late stage stuff, I think maybe that was less common even, or maybe even considered not okay.
Your intuition is correct.
Okay, all right.
The early Roman Republic period, 509 to 20 BCE, same-sex relations were common and accepted within certain parameters governed by social status and roles rather than gender. The key distinction in Roman sexual morality was between being an active or a passive partner rather than the gender of one's partner. For Roman men, maintaining the active penetrative role was socially acceptable regardless of their partner's gender. The passive role was considered appropriate for only of those of lower status, typically slaves, prostitute, and young men who had not yet reached full citizen status. Yeah. The system was firmly established by the Mid-Republic. During the late Republic and early Empire, 1st century BCE to 1st century CE, we see abundant literary and artistic evidence of same-sex relations, particularly in the work of poets like Catullus, Tibullus, and Martial. Emperor Hadrian's relationship with Antonius, 1107 to 138 CE, is perhaps the most famous historical example. It's worth noting that while same-sex practices were accepted, others were stigmatized. Adult male citizens who preferred the passive role could face social ridicule and even legal penalties during certain periods as they violated expected gender norms. The attitudes began to shift with the rise of Christianity in the later empire, 4th century CE onwards, which generally condemned same-sex relationships. By the time of Emperor Justinian, 6th century CE, laws explicitly prohibiting same-sex relations were established.
There you go. So we have the opposite case here.
The exact opposite case. In Rome, a normalization of some types, now they still had rules around the types of gay sex you could have, but normalization of some types of gay sex were normal.
Yeah.
In the Roman Empire. Yeah. And actually sex became more restrictive with the Roman Empire's conversion to Christianity, particularly around gayness. Mm-hmm. But I'd make a note here. Something you might not be thinking is what is reflected in this is the idea that the periods that precede or are during the rise of a culture and cultural flourishing come with strict sexual norms and restrictions. This male sex needed.
It was still heavily regulated.
Yes, male sex needn't be among the restrictions, but you need cultural restrictions. And so what we might be seeing in something like, Islam or something like that is these periods represent a degradation of restrictions and rule following within the religious system. And that gayness specifically has nothing to do with it. Let's go. The next one I'm thinking, well, Greeks, they were pretty gay. Well, actually, this was interesting because Leather Apron Club argues that gayness was not widely practiced in ancient Greece. And his arguments are he's like a smart guy. Like, I think he's got like an agenda, but like, he's a smart guy. Like his arguments are fairly compelling. We go over his argument about Jews in one of our episodes. Are Jews actually not smarter? And I argue that he's actually probably right, but he's wrong in his second part where he goes, and this is proof that they are cheating and that they have gotten all these powers through ill gain. I'm like, well, actually, here's all the evidence that it's cultural, and that's why they do better on IQ tests and everything like that, is that they have cultural practices and dominance hierarchies tied to academic accomplishments that lead to them overperforming in these areas. But his episode on gays and Asian accents, I'm like, it was weird because it's almost like an anti-classic Republican episode, because if gays weren't in ancient Athens, then they didn't contribute to the collapse of the Greek city-states, right? So what? Like, okay. So you don't get the JD Unwin argument there, but okay. So I decided to dig into this. All right. Yeah. Classical Athens, 5th to 4th century BCE, is perhaps known for institutionalized pedestry, relationships between adult men, Orestes, and adolescent boys, or nomes. These relationships were often educational and mentoring in nature alongside their sexual component, and were relatively formalized within aristocratic circles. Sparta had institutionalized same-sex relationships as well, although for different purposes. Some scholars suggested that intimate bonds between warriors were encouraged the way to strengthen military cohesion. Thebes had the famous sacred band, an elite military unit composed of 150 pairs of male lovers, based on the belief that men would fight more valiantly to protect or impress their partners. Archaic period, 8th to 6th centuries BCE. Evidence suggests that same-sex relationships were already well-established cultural practices, seen in the poetry of Sappho from Lesbos, whose name gives us the term lesbian, and others. Actually, we don't know if those poems were even written, in a lesbian way. There's actually a pretty strong argument they're not. Nope. But that is the mainstream position, the one I just gave you. But what's important is I ask the AI to go through every period of Greek history and then tell me, were gays accepted during that period or were they not accepted during that period? So even if it's making a mistake here, like overstating how accepted it was, then understating how unaccepted it was in later periods, then they go, the symposium, drinking party culture among elite men was another context. Interactions were common as depicted in works like Plato's Symposium. As with Rome, Greek attitudes were structured around status and roles rather than gender. Adult citizens were expected to take the active role, while younger males or inferiors took the passive role. These relationships typically followed age-based patterns. The younger partner was expected to grow up and become the active partner in relationships with others. Okay. The Hellenistic period, so this is a later period, 323 to 31 BCE, after Alexander the Great. So this is, when Greece expanded and took over like most of the known world and was in its period of cultural height. Not cultural height, but this was like the I guess the result of the success of Greek culture. Now, of course, Alexander the Great came from a different cultural background. He was seen as sort of barbarous by the Greek people. And you could argue that his ability to conquer them could be seen as a failing of Greek culture, which could to the argument that the earlier acceptance led to this collapse. I don't really buy that. I see his culture as contiguous with Greek culture. And so I would argue that if his culture had a success, if the Hellenistic period had a success, that was partially as a result of whatever was being done before that. In the Hellenistic period, several factors contributed to changing attitudes. Specifically, they became significantly more anti-gay. The mixing of Greek and non-Greek cultures led to more diverse perspectives on sexuality. The rise of philosophical schools like Stoicism emphasized sexual restraint more generally. The decline of the polis, the city-state, weakened some of the institutional contexts where same-sex relationships flourish. And shifting political structures moved away from the citizen-focused culture that had supported certain forms of same-sex relationships.
All right, this trend is clear. There's just a consistent loss of discipline that leads to civilizational decline. It doesn't matter who is having sex with whom.
Yeah, I then asked another AI, and it gave me the same results about ancient Greek as in Rome, but then it also went into Japan, which wasn't in the first one. So let's look into this.
Okay.
Japan, the Edo period, 1603 to 1868. No moral stigma, historical homosexuality accepted, especially among samurai. Outlawed in 1873 to 1880 to emulate the West. Now legal with protections. Post-World War II recovery, quick economic cultural powerhouse. No correlation with disintegration. Acceptance linked to prosperity, not decline, challenging the claim. So in only one of the instances in the Islamic Empire could I find... Now, JD Unwin said he went through 83 empires. I'm going to bet in his 83 empires, he listed Greeks and Romans as having debauchery and then having civilizational collapse. Except now we're learning that that's hundreds of years apart. So Rome is such an obvious counterexample. I actually wanted to check this. Did he mark Rome as, a rare counterexample to his theory, or did he mark it as one of the cases that supported his theory? Because if he marked it as one of the cases that supported his theory, I think it's pretty clear that he was acting in bad faith in the other examples he was using. And he marked it one as an instance that supported his theory, but he also seemed to be aware that the sexual morality of the later empire was much stricter than the sexual morality of the early empire. And so here's how he argued against that, because apparently he went into it in detail. He focused on the specific aspects of Roman sexuality that did follow his pattern. For example, he emphasized the supposed sexual discipline of the early Republic in Rome and contrasted it with the perceived excesses of the later Republic and early Empire. Now, here, I know that the sexual discipline of the early Republic Rome was written about in the later empire. It was people looking back to the old days and being like, oh, things used to be so good in the old days. It wasn't written about in the early empire that way. Then he tended to interpret later Rome empire's increased sexual restrictiveness, which came with Christianization, not as a genuine return to sexual restraint, but as a reaction to previous excesses, essentially arguing that the damage had already been done. But that doesn't work with his three-generation theories, because that was a period of hundreds of years. He sometimes conflated different periods of Roman history in ways that made the timeline fit his theory better, not always clearly distinguishing between Republic and Empire or between early and late Empire in his analysis. He emphasized other factors beyond just homosexuality, looking at marriage practices, divorce rates, and other aspects of sexual behavior. So it appears that and I hate to say this because, it'd be based and interesting if his theory was right, but JD Unwin appears to have been arguing in bad faith. And not really looking at the data. Yeah, I get the mechanism of action, right? Like it actually makes sense if you think through it. You're like, okay, well, if you loosen some cultural norms, right, there's likely other cultural norms that are being loosened, and you see sort of a degradation across. Also, historically speaking, same-sex relationships were really dangerous. There was like from a disease risk. There's a reason like the AIDS phenomenon was such a danger to people. Like there is in a historic context, a degree of selfishness to risk exposing your society to the diseases that could come from this. So you could argue it's a sign of moral degradation within a society. Maybe. This is also why I would argue that same-sex relationships between women are banned so rarely, historically speaking.
Yeah.
They're not even banned in the Bible, which is interesting. So, what are your thoughts more broadly? Like, I understand the mechanism of action, but it doesn't appear to be being picked up by history.
Yeah, and I wonder why.
Well, because it's probably not a real phenomenon. Like, my guess is that what you're actually seeing is that if you build a culture where gayness works and you're strict on other rules, like other forms of stoicism, being gayness is not deleterious to a culture.
Yeah, I think so. Here's my take in general is that because people have sometimes, just based on your framework for sexuality, people have very strong arousal or disgust responses to sexually related stimuli. And the average man is going to have a strong disgust reaction to male sex. Mm-hmm. And as a result, a lot of men are going to get really hung up on man-to-man sex. And I think that makes them hyper-focused on it as like a problem that arises in history. I also really love your framework of cultures, like from hard to soft to super soft cultures. And I think that basically because people have such strong instinctual disgust and arousal reactions to various forms of sex, and because most people haven't really thought about religions in terms of hard to soft, but rather Christianity and Islam and Buddhism, that they're not really seeing this very clear pattern of, no, this is about how much discipline you have. This is about how much fitness you're imparting to your adherents. And that's what they're missing.
Yeah. Yeah. And that is not congruent with even, I'd argue, modern gay culture. Like there's been a branch of modern gay culture that you could call like wholesome gays, or the gay dad phenomenon, where they obviously, if you like know them, are actually pretty strict around a lot of the moral laws that they follow.
Well, and they're also like high performing professionals who work really hard. This is why so much of the data demonstrates that children of, for example, gay couples have better outcomes than your average kid, because they are born to very conscientious, hardworking parents.
But then you've got to ask, okay, well, then what is causing the higher rates of abuse within gay culture? And here I'd say it's cultural bifurcation that you get within gay culture. I actually think a part of the wholesome gay phenomenon is caused by the debauched gay phenomenon, which is to say, gays are sort of in a position that you, as a straight man, will never get to be in if you want a hedonism max. You're like always better off being a gay man because like you can go to a party. Like I was just thinking, like there is nothing as a straight man I can go to that's like the functional equivalent of like Fire Island or something like that.
100%.
Like
100%.
everyone's down to F at any time. Like, and you are the thing they desire. Like that is going to lead to a level of debauchery really quickly. And because they're already breaking one sexual norm, the normalization of breaking other sexual norms happened much faster within the wider gay community. So sort of like debauchery maxing became a part of the gay community. And I think that the reactive wholesome gay community is in a big way, like their wholesomeness is a mirror because they have seen the lack of satisfaction that comes out of the debauched pathway. That these people often end up, not satisfied with the choices they made when they hit their late 30s. And that they're like, hey, it actually made sense to follow a lot of those other Christian people.
Right. So, they could just be, gay people who matured after having a lot of fun and then decided that there was more to life than just hedonic pleasure. So
I don't think matured is fair. I mean, I think you can mature and learn more and still choose hedonism, but I it's not the choice that I would make. I think that saying matured over centralizes our perspective. But yeah, what was the most surprising part of this for you? Because this was actually surprising to me.
I had no idea that there was any gayness in Islam ever.
Oh, like, really?
Yes.
You don't see the Muslim guys like walking around holding hands all the time?
Well, I don't know, like, and the kissing.
Yeah, the kissing, the guys kissing.
I was just
like
yeah,
each other.
I don't know, like I just saw that as a cultural difference. I don't see that as gay. And I mean, clearly it's not, because it's super not allowed.
By the way, I mean, you super get killed for being gay in a Muslim country now.
Yeah.
Like,
so like when I see men in a super Islamic country holding hands, I'm like, well, they're definitely not like no homo because
actually, that's a really good point. If you look at Muslim culture now, like the culture in like Gaza or something like that, they are uniquely restrictive and have been for a long time around things like gayness, and yet are having the opposite of cultural flourishing. They're in a state of cultural like deranged
degradation.
Spiral. And you see this across the Muslim world right now.
Yeah.
I'd actually argue, generally speaking, like I'm thinking modern times, like let's say post-industrial revolution or like around the period of the industrialization revolution of modern times, I can't think of anywhere where gays have been heavily suppressed that produced a flourishing of art or culture.
Well, but let's look at this from a more practical standpoint, right? So like mainstream culture permits gayness is way too loose. What would a modern version of a more hard culture that nevertheless supports LGBTQIA plus lifestyles, like what would that look like? Would it force strict monogamy? Would it force, like with ancient Rome, more of a hierarchy? What would it look like in a way that imparts fitness and corrects for some of the damaging elements of, I mean, gay and straight lifestyles?
Well, I mean, I think the commandments that you sort of have within the techno-Puritan tradition of severe austerity, anti-idolatry, these sorts of traits, not severe austerity, but austerity for the sake of austerity, giving up things that make your life marginally harder, but are non-distractive to you, like just not indulgent austerity is a powerful one. I think, structuring relationships the way you would with traditional straight relationships, get married, have kids, etc.
So in other words, a good gay relationship would be just like a good straight relationship, a business partnership first and foremost, not focused on pleasure or fun or things like that.
Yeah, not focus on pleasure, focus on like a mutual goal for your life. I think that would likely lead to more positive outcomes. When I was noting like, oh, where did people would be like, oh, you're forgetting 1950s America, like gays were not accepted there. And I'm like, yeah, but if I'm talking in like the grand scheme of human history, i.e. like acceptance of gays, they were actually pretty accepted. They weren't like as extremely as accepted as they are today, but they were probably about as accepted as they were in ancient Greece. And you're like, what? You could
But
have
I'm
been
also, I
killed for
don't
being gay back
see,
then, and you could have been killed for being gay in ancient Greece. Like even
I don't
during the
see
periods of
the greatest generation as having a good culture. And the reason why is they created the boomers.
yeah, they did.
Like, really? You think that, I mean, those were the ones who really stopped having kids. And, you know, we to a great extent judge the success of a culture by the number of grandchildren they have.
Yeah.
Boomers just don't have a lot of kids. And so the greatest generation, at least in the United States, doesn't have a lot of grandchildren. And I just don't really see that as a sign of successful parenting.
Yeah. Yeah. I thought this was an interesting dive, and a lot of people have expected us to flip on the gay thing, and I'm just like, it's
to be like,
what happened?
I see that this terrible lifestyle.
Well, because they know that we flipped on the trans thing, right? Like at first we were just like, you know, transitioning kids is wrong, trans people in sports is wrong, but like trans adults, this is a real phenomenon that is not socially deleterious. Whereas now we're like, it actually appears to be a culture-bound illness that leads to really high rates of unaliving ideation.
Yeah.
And so like,
it doesn't even seem to create ideal outcomes for those who
like it doesn't seem to help anyone.
It
seems closer to if somebody has anorexia, which we argue in other videos also a culture-bound illness, you know, overly represented in autistic populations, focus on body dysmorphia, doesn't appear in most cultures, just when they contact a culture that has anorexia, all of a sudden it appears, is if you like removed trans women's uteruses to make them lighter, and you're like, look, they're happy with the surgery, so clearly it's a good thing that we did this. And everyone else would be like, what? And then you like removed one of their...
You mean if you removed anorexic women's uteruses?
Oh yeah, you removed like one of anorexic women's kidney and a uterus. You're like, look, they can live without these organs, right? Like, and they're happy with the surgery. And you, having been an anorexic woman, would be like, yeah, I'm lighter now. Like, fewer organs, yay! Like, but the mere fact that they're okay with the surgery doesn't mean it's the best way. We should focus on making them not anorexic.
Mm-hmm.
And I point out here that like especially in doing this research, again, you see gayness appear everywhere in human history. Every culture has, you know, either prohibitions against it or whatever. You typically didn't even need prohibitions against trans because it's just not a thing that existed historically or in any other culture. You have different gender presentations, but an obsession with being seen as a specific gender is not seen anywhere in human history or in any other culture. And everywhere the gay trans people point to it, they're just lying. Like it's clearly just Twinkie gay guys if you research that culture, or just cross-dressers, or just men who present differently. It's never an obsession with being seen as a specific gender to the point that you will kill yourself if people don't see you as that gender, which is the thing that makes it so destructive. It's the gender dysphoria that's making it so destructive. So that's why I changed on that. I changed on that because the evidence, like as I gained access to more of it, with this, unfortunately, as I gain access to more evidence, I'm just not seeing evidence that there is a broad civilizational reason to ban this.
Yeah. But there is a broad necessity for everyone to consider what is the hard culture version of your values.
Yeah.
You should not be living a soft culture life, whatever your values may be.
And maybe don't celebrate debauchery for the sake of debauchery. Like I would definitely say that there are some parts of gay culture that are likely socially deleterious.
And there are parts of straight culture that are socially deleterious.
Yeah, so
I'm agnostic as to the configuration of it. So yeah.
Change your mind about anything from this conversation or not?
You know, I hadn't, if someone had made the blanket claim that every time a culture starts to accept same-sex relationships, it starts to fall, I wouldn't immediately have a rebuttal. I'd be a little concerned, like, oh, what, really? I'm not sure about that. I don't know. I'm going to have to look this up. And I'm glad that my intuition about ancient Rome was correct. I'm glad that basically your findings broadly demonstrate that the big correlatory factor is not acceptance of same-sex relationships. It is acceptance of looser social norms.
Yeah. And just, the way that somebody would argue out of this, just so I can provide the comment I would give out on the other side of this, is, well, Rome functionally socially collapsed long before the empire fell. And that this social collapse happened before the Christians took power, before the restrictions on sexuality happened. And then they'd say of ancient Greece, well, Alexander the Greek, Alexander did represent a collapse of the Greek city-state empire. So couldn't you say that it led to collapse in that way? And we know Sparta had basically collapsed as a powerhouse from before Alexander mopped up. So can't we say that it did lead to a collapse? And I'd be like, I guess, but then you just get to choose where the collapse happened to fit your timeline, right?
Yeah, it's just very convenient.
I'm using AI without biasing it. I am saying, okay, when was gayness accepted in one chat, and then when did empires collapse in a different chat?
Right. Yeah.
So I'm basing it on what the AI has to say about this.
Yeah.
Anyway.
Which I feel more comfortable with. So, yeah, glad you put that out there, though. I guess a lot of people are going to be so disappointed.
So mad. Oh, Malcolm.
Just how dare you say it's okay to be gay?
I love how mad leftists get when pronatalism gets attention publicly.
Or happy if the attention
is seen as negative.
Is plausibly
subreddit put us on the front page. You were the top post. Which I thought was really fun. They're like, oh, look, CNN's making fun of pronatalism. And it's like, I'm sure they would jump to our side if they realized you guys existed as a significant movement. 17%, by the way. Was that of Americans, or who was in the sample survey?
Americans. It was census representative.
Thought the world would be better without people.
Yeah.
All right.
What? Could it be? What is it, Toasty?
It's a 12 full card.
Okay, let's put it up on the table. Take a look. Wow.
Wow, what's up in it?
Okay.